Okay, good morning, everyone, and whatever time it is, if you watch this recorded later, this is Kirsten Logan, the training coordinator from COVA. I'm so happy to be joined by Karen Napolitano from LCHT for the third and final of our specific human trafficking series. You should receive an email a little later on today, which is your proof of attendance. If you are applying for COVA's voluntary victim advocate certification, you will need to submit that email with your certification packet. If you are watching this training later online, we hope that you find it useful. However, archived webinars may not be used towards COVA's voluntary victim advocate certification. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kara.
Thank you, Kirsten. And hello, everyone. I'll just turn my video on briefly to say hi before I turn it off and get started. Thanks so much for joining for a third session here. For those of you who maybe weren't in attendance for the first two, this is kind of the third in a three-part series of human trafficking conversations. And so we've already kind of dove into human trafficking 101, really looking at red flags and behavioral cues, and then the complexities of disclosure there. And today we're going to look at trauma, the complex trauma that accompanies human trafficking experience, be that labor or sex trafficking, and how that may feel or how that may affect investigations. And I want to talk about that through the lens of an advocate or somebody that's working to support a victim, as well as from a law enforcement perspective, somebody who is trying to complete an investigation. So I'll be kind of teetering back and forth between those different identities, especially given the participation today. We were able to look at your registration and kind of know, at least have an idea of who's on the call today. So I'm going to turn off my video now. Okay. So just as, one or two, maybe three of the slides that you'll see today, you've seen before, if you've attended any of these previous trainings. But I just want to make sure we're always on the same page as we start these really difficult conversations. And so what I have here, this very first slide, this what is human trafficking slide, you have seen in both of the previous presentations. But again, it's really important that we're remembering the different forms of trafficking in the way that we've defined it federally in the United States. So in the US, under the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, we've got these three categories of trafficking. And as we talk through the various forms of trauma that people may experience, and how that may result in trauma bonding potentially, and or just trauma responses, which are inevitable. I want you to be thinking about these different categories of trafficking, because it's going to show up differently, right, for everyone, for every individual and for every individual experience. And so we want to remember that those under the age of 18 involved in commercial sex acts, we've differentiated from those who are 18 and over. In our US definition of trafficking, we said we do not have to prove an element of force or fraud or coercion for those who are under the age of 18 involved in any form of commercial sex. We've talked through how complex that is in previous presentations, so I won't dive too deep into that. But it is important to remember that not everyone under the age of 18 involved in commercial sex will self-identify as a victim of trafficking. And it can be re-traumatizing or triggering to impose a label like that on somebody who doesn't self-identify that way. So just something to keep in the back of your mind as we talk through this. That is the same for 18 and over. Not everyone is going to self-identify as a victim or a survivor of trafficking. Even if we are clear by the definition and what they are disclosing to us that it is true. So even if we know that they've experienced trafficking, that still doesn't mean that they'll self-identify or that they'll want to. And then I really want to stress that we are also talking about forced labor. We see forced labor happen in Colorado, oftentimes alongside sex trafficking. The one example that I've been using recently is somebody who's being forced to sell sex against their will, and also forced to rob the people that they are selling sex to, the sex buyers. And so that would be an example of forced sex trafficking as well as forced labor. So we see, forced labor for all kinds of kind of illicit drug dealing or panhandling or even breaking and entering. And then we also see forced labor happening in regular markets like agriculture, ranching, construction, restaurants, hospitality in general, landscaping, domestic servitude. And all of those types of experiences will often have other forms of either exploitation or abuse happening alongside them. And so it's just something to be thinking about when we're thinking through these complex traumas. We have, there's 3 forms of trauma: acute, chronic, or complex. Acute is just is the trauma that someone experiences from one event. Chronic trauma is something like abuse or domestic violence, something that happens over time. And complex is multiple forms of trauma, usually having something to do with an interpersonal relationship. And so that's where we see human trafficking fit into that category most likely. So when we're talking about trauma, I mean, I'm often talking to healthcare providers, and of course, this isn't really the case with most of this group today. But sometimes it does get confused as physical trauma. So just to be clear, we're talking about psychological trauma. And I'm not a trained physician, so I won't talk too much about what happens to the brain itself. Though there are lots of really cool, 5 to 8 minute videos out there that you can watch and kind of see what happens physiologically to the brain when it experiences trauma, especially when it experiences complex trauma. But for our purposes, I think the most important thing to remember is that the brain, when it experiences trauma, gets stuck in survival mode. So the complex human brain, the way that it works, it sort of gets stymied by this traumatic or these multiple traumatic experiences. And so the part of the brain that is most advanced, that helps us to determine if something is safe or unsafe, is funny or not funny, really isn't getting used when somebody is in a traumatic state. Instead, they're in their more reptilian brain, the earlier part of the way our brains developed, and they're in survival mode. We often, or many people, have heard the term fight, flight, or freeze. Perhaps you haven't heard the term fawn, but that is relatively new to this conversation, but maybe not for everyone. Oops. And what we mean by that is somebody who is trying to please the person that is traumatizing them. So we'll talk more about some examples of fawn a little bit later. So the brain is stuck in survival mode when it experiences trauma. And what that means is that somebody is trying to survive. They are doing what they've learned or what they've been told will allow them to survive whatever experience they're in. And then this is another slide that you have already seen, so I won't spend too much time here. But the kinds of traumas that we're talking about, what do I mean when I say a traumatic experience? I want you to be remembering this push and pull factor slide. Because a lot of these traumas that kind of get somebody into a situation that are pushing somebody into a vulnerable situation that somebody could step in and exploit are sort of listed here. Of course, not all of them are, but some of these early traumas, abuse, neglect, or isolation, the experience of homelessness, the experience of poverty, the experience of marginalization or discrimination, the experience of being involved in systems, for example, child welfare, are some of those early traumas that someone will experience that will then be played on, I guess, in order to exploit them, and then of course become exacerbated, right? Because they're a traumatic experience they experienced in the past, and now they're being re-traumatized, and there's additional new traumas. That's what makes this all so complex. I use the example of foster care. I always try to tread lightly because there are so many wonderful child welfare folks out there that I work closely with. But this is, I think, a really important quote, something to remember, that the experience of foster care is sometimes thought of as sort of training for commercial sexual exploitation. They were used to being moved around without warning, without any say, not knowing where they were going or allowed to pack their clothes. This experience should sound traumatic, because it is, right? Being moved without warning and without any say, and not allowed to pack any of your beloved things. That in it of itself would be traumatic, but it sort of sets somebody up for that expectation in the future. I expect somebody to be profiting off of me living with them, right? I want to cover ACEs in this presentation. I think it's super important. I want us to be thinking about, again, all types of trafficking here, not just sex trafficking. So this adverse childhood experiences study was done in 1995 originally. It was originally a study that was done looking at obesity levels. And they were trying to figure out why some folks were losing the weight and keeping it off, and some folks were losing the weight and not keeping it off. Why were some of them going back to their, potentially unhealthy eating habits? And over time, what these scientists determined was that they could predict relatively well, I guess, the adoption of health risk behaviors. They could predict potential negative health outcomes due to traumatic childhood experiences or adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. So what you're looking at here are the first 8, 3 forms of abuse, 5 forms of household challenges, and the other 2 are 2 forms of neglect, emotional neglect or physical neglect. We added 4 new categories in 2015, but I'm mostly going to focus on these first 10 for the purposes of this conversation. So what this experiment found was that if somebody had experienced 4 or more of these early childhood experiences, adverse childhood experiences, sorry, so I'm kind of going back through them. So 4 or more of these 10, that they were significantly more likely to then experience social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, potentially the adoption of health risk behaviors, disease, disability, and social problems, and even early death. Now, the experiment didn't say if you have 4 ACEs, this is definitely going to happen to you. It just made it significantly more likely. These are just some of the findings. So what they said is, as the number of ACEs increases, the number of adverse childhood experiences, so does risk for the following. So what you're looking at here is an abbreviated list of some of these experiences that somebody might have or are significantly more likely to experience as an adult if as a child they experienced 4 or more ACEs. So alcoholism, suicide attempts, sexually transmitted diseases, financial stress, risk for sexual violence. These are all sort of related to a trafficking experience, which is why I chose these specific sequelae. In 2015, they did a study that were linking ACEs to trafficking specifically. So that's this chart that you're looking at now is from that experiment. So in 2015, they gave the ACE test, the 10 questions, have you experienced these 10 things, to around 67,000 kids in the juvenile justice system in Florida. So there were 67,000 kids in the juvenile justice system in Florida at this time. They gave them all the ACE study. The black line represents those 67 kids who had experienced sex trafficking. And the gray line is they had not experienced sex trafficking, but they still were in the juvenile justice system. So they may have experienced some abuse or neglect or any kind of trauma at that point. What this chart is showing you are the percentages of the cohort of those who are in the juvenile justice system that experience each of the 10 ACEs. So if you look at the black line, what you see is 50 or 60% of these kids had suffered from emotional, physical, or sexual abuse of those who'd been trafficked, right? 40% had experienced emotional or physical neglect. These numbers are really stark, incredibly high. Now, the numbers are pretty high for those in the juvenile justice system as well that hadn't experienced trafficking, but I still think it's pretty significant for those who had. And then this is showing the average number of ACEs that kids had experienced. So again, the gray line is those who had not been trafficked, but were in the juvenile justice system. And the black line is those who had been trafficked. So look at these average numbers here. The average for those who hadn't is 3, and for those who had is like 5, but really high numbers for 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 as well. And I really want you to think about what the household that has 10 ACEs looks like. And I want us to also be thinking about in a labor trafficking situation, often, not often, but well, often, I guess, immigrants are being trafficked in labor trafficking situations. Of course, not all the time. And many of the immigrants that we're talking about have come from countries where they have also experienced types of community violence and poverty. So just something to be thinking about as well. Here's another one of the slides that you have seen in the past, but I'm just going to go through this quickly. So how that shows up for us, so those young people grow up to be older people who have experienced all of those things, right? And unless they've gone through the really hard work of healing this trauma, they're still carrying it with them. Right, so they're feeling shame or embarrassment over their choices. Often we're victim blaming in this country. People make bad choices. Why did they fall for that? They're stupid. So people are ashamed or embarrassed. They have a sense of duty or loyalty to their trafficker. And we're going to go into trauma bonds in just a little bit. Fear is pretty obvious. And then they have that obvious mistrust of institutions or law enforcement. That doesn't happen always. These are just common survivor reactions. And so they may refuse our service. They may refuse assistance. They may not want to cooperate with an investigation because there isn't any trust, because they're not being treated with respect, because they're being re-traumatized every time they talk to somebody. Whatever the reason is, we have to start with understanding. So if we are going to be trauma-informed institutions, if we are going to be survivor-centered in our approach, then we must be trauma-informed. And that doesn't, there's 4 pieces here, as you can see. It starts with realizing the widespread impact of trauma and understanding potential paths for recovery. That's kind of what we're doing now and what we've done over the last 2 sessions, and recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma. Absolutely, we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about some of those today, but we spent about an hour doing that in the last session as well. So those 2 are sort of covered by this, by these presentations, but it doesn't stop there. And I think that's where a lot of agencies and organizations fall short, is they sort of take a training on what happens to the brain when it experiences trauma. They get a list of red flags and behavioral cues, and they check the box. The other parts of a trauma-informed care approach are that you actively resist re-traumatization to the best of your ability, meaning not only are you recognizing those signs and symptoms, but then you're trying to figure out how to avoid that re-traumatization in supporting a survivor, especially if that person is potentially going to report and be part of an investigation later. And then fully integrating the knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. So it's not just how you treat one individual, but that your protocol, the way that all of the folks who work in your agency or organization is adjusted based on this. That is super important, that consistency. We find we have trouble sometimes finding if a law enforcement officer that we have contact with around the state is off duty or on vacation, if not everybody in their department has had a human trafficking training or has had trauma training, we can sometimes have a hard time finding the right person that we're going to send out to talk to somebody who's experienced this complex trauma. It's so important that these policies and procedures and practices are consistent across all your agencies. So what's the difference, right? What's the difference between just being informed or actually being responsive? So we've already said we're incorporating that knowledge about trauma into every aspect of the service delivery. We're engaging and empowering survivors. I know these are a lot of buzzwords, but it's important to really think about what that means, right? How we are putting ourselves into a room with somebody where we're willing to have a conversation, being cognizant of the fact that survivors might not have access to transportation, or that they might not want to come into a government building or a law enforcement building to have a conversation, that they'd feel much more comfortable meeting, you know, in a subway or in a coffee shop. So engaging and empowering survivors to actually make choices about how they want to do this is so important, not just to building trust. I mean, trust is the foundation for all of this, and we've talked about that at great length already. But it's important to the investigation itself, to cooperation in the investigation, and to getting as much information as you can. We talked about harm reduction 2 weeks ago, so I won't go into that now. And then always remembering to value your own self-care as we work in this really, really difficult space. This you've seen before, I think. I showed you this last week. You know, these are real quotes. You know, there's no accusations here. I don't anticipate that any of the people on this call have ever said anything like this, but I do know that these things are being said because I've heard it myself pretty recently. And so if this is what people have in the back of their minds, even if none of you have ever even considered saying anything like this, it doesn't matter, because if someone ever did, then we're lumped into that group, right? We're the kinds of people that may say these things. This is what we're thinking. And so this makes us unsafe. This makes us untrustworthy, these types of things that people say. So the lack of trauma-informed institutions often leads to the punishment of trauma behaviors. This is huge, especially when it comes to young people, but it's huge when it comes to older people too, right? We punish people in school for falling asleep in class. We punish people for missing things. We punish people for being late. So often those are trauma behaviors. It may just be a small thing, that kind of punishment, or it may be repeated and resulting in someone dropping out of school or flunking out of school or losing their job. We mischaracterize choice, right? They chose to get in that car. They're stupid. They made bad choices, right? It's their own fault. They're trying to feed their drug habit. People miss it. That happens all the time, and I know that firsthand just by working with service providers around the state, that after I give these trainings, people say, yeah, now that I've had this training, I know that I've missed it. And we re-traumatize. Often service providers are not trauma informed. It is not part of their training. It is not their fault. But not everybody is required to know the history of every client that they work with. And so we are re-traumatizing without knowing it. If you haven't read this report, please do. It was written in 2015, I think. In fact, no, 2014, sorry. It's the Sex Abuse to Prison Pipeline. It's like a 40-page report that totally changed my perspective. This particular slide is talking about girls and boys in the juvenile justice system. And 45% of girls in the juvenile justice system, according to this study, had 5 or more ACEs. So if you're thinking back to that ACE study and you're thinking about what those ACEs were, what we're seeing is that girls and boys are acting out, they're having trauma behavior, and they're ending up in the juvenile justice system because of it. I think these numbers are really staggering. And what does that mean? So somebody experiences sex abuse or trafficking in their home, they're in a poorly supervised child welfare placement, they've got unaddressed trauma, mental or physical health issues, they then have reactive behavior, they enter into the juvenile justice system at some point, their trauma symptoms are triggered, and sometimes there are new incidences of abuse that happen within the systems. They're then released into the community with exacerbated trauma symptoms. Their trauma coping behaviors resume, and they're sent back to their abusive environment. And then a new arrest can occur, and the cycle repeats itself. So we can stop this. We really can. It's going to take some work. We're in conversations now with Denver courts, looking at how we can have more trauma-informed courts, more healing courts, in order to not punish people for their trauma behaviors if they get that far into the system. I want to talk through one scenario quickly. This is a true story, but of course the name is not correct. I want you to see what Brittany experienced within her systems. So these dates on the left are accurate. 2007 through 2011 are shown here. The first time that Brittany had a touch point with a system was Child Protective Services in 2007. So there was an abuse complaint. So you're looking at the agency, the complaint, and the action. There was some absence from school. The schools and Child Protective Services are involved in these early years. She was quite young in 2007, under the age of 10. So we see abuse, we see absence, we see maltreatment, we see truancy in these first few years. Juvenile court shows up in 2011 for the first time, and then there is a custody transfer. And then from 2011 to 2013, the complaints are exacerbated, right? There's more truancy, there's fighting in school, shoplifting, so police get involved, right? So police are involved in 2 or 3 of these. It looks like she's on probation, she's getting suspended. So the actions that are taken are getting more extreme as she's getting a little bit older. Still a very young kid here. And then in 2013 and 2014, she's running away, she's assaulted by an adult, she's fighting, right? Police are involved significantly more, as you can see, as well as Child Protective Services, because she's only 13. Right, and all of this time, Brittany was being trafficked. In all of these different touch points that she had with all of these different systems, nobody noticed. Or nobody asked the right questions, or nobody was a trusting adult. I can't say exactly what happened here, but what I can know for sure is that there's a lack of trust on Brittany's behalf, right? There's no way that she can look at this group here, what family, school, peers, and community, and say, oh yeah, well, like I trust all of those different institutions, like those are my people, right? She's being punished for her trauma behaviors pretty severely in all of these cases. Okay, so I want to switch over to trauma bonds just for a few minutes here. Well, we've all heard of Stockholm Syndrome probably, so I won't spend too much time on the definition here. But again, it's an unconscious strategy for survival. We're in survival mode. And we're looking at the power dynamics of a trafficking situation specifically in this conversation today, and that the bond that someone is going to feel with their trafficker. Remember from previous trainings, most people know their trafficker, overwhelmingly. So more than 50% are being trafficked by a family member or loved one. There's schools involved, teachers and coaches. We just had a case of a Boston priest who was trafficking young kids, who was arrested. People are trafficked by their employer. Often they're recruited by a peer in both labor and sex trafficking situations. And so it's not so far-fetched to think that somebody may bond with their trafficker. Perhaps they've already bonded with their trafficker because it's a parent, or perhaps it's a new relationship. But again, if we're thinking back to that push and pull factors slide, the trafficker in most cases has provided, right? They have filled that need. They have exploited a vulnerability to do so. It's not okay, but they have filled that need. They've gotten that person off the street. They've gotten them some food. They have a place to stay. Maybe they have a new family, right? And so there is again a more obvious connection here. These kinds of trauma bonds are really common. Some components of trauma bonding, it mostly has to do with the victim's perception, right, of the relationship. So they're scared. This person got me off the street, and if I leave them, I'm going back, right? Their perception of acts of kindness. Well, they took care of me this one time, or they protected me this one time, or they gave me, an extra, hamburger, or whatever it is. And these small acts of kindness are proof that in fact that trafficker loves them too. Usually, not always, trafficking survivors are being isolated, but they're isolated purposefully from the people who may support them. So it's not just physical isolation that I'm talking about here, as we know that most people aren't necessarily locked up, but emotional isolation. You've been told so many times by your trafficker that your parents don't love you, or your caseworker isn't actually going to help you, but instead try to take you away, those kinds of things. So they're feeling isolated, and their trafficker and their traffic family is maybe their only family in their minds. And that perceived inability to escape, these are all kind of playing into each other, but again, it's not necessarily physical escape, but instead think about that list of quotes that I put up just a few minutes ago. If you feel like the people who are supposed to help don't care about you and actually think that you're worthless, then you really don't have anywhere to escape to. So you might know this sucks. You might know I don't want to be here, but where else are you going to go? Where's the better place, right? And we also talked about barriers to access. If there are so many barriers to accessing resources, again, there's no blame here. I'm not blaming any one organization or even any one system. The way that we have set things up and the way that things are funded means that we have to have limitations, and those limitations can be really daunting, right? I'm transgender in the greater Denver area. There's only a couple places that I'm going to feel welcomed. If I have a dog, there's only a couple places they're going to let me in. If I have kids, there are places that will support me, but if I don't have kids, maybe not. Or I'm the wrong gender in general, if I'm male or female or transgender, and I just can't get into certain shelters. Sometimes it really just feels like there's nowhere to escape to. These are some symptoms and indications of a trauma bond. So we talked through lots of red flags and behavioral clues a couple weeks ago. These are some symptoms specifically of trauma bonding. So we see insomnia, flashbacks, distrust. The last one on the list, that sees the world from the exploiter's perspective. I think that's really important, right? That you've been living with or working for this individual for so long. They've been inundating you with information. That's been your only source of information, and they've identified who the outsiders are, who the insiders are, who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, and so you come to learn who that is. Again, it's fairly obvious. It's just something that we don't think about too much. And we've already seen these, refusing help, running away, being aggressive, displaying unclear or disjointed memories. That is really common in a trauma response. And that's something that can sometimes sound like lying. And none of us like it when people lie. So that's super important to remember, that somebody who's experienced trauma might not be remembering things in a linear way. The other thing I want you to remember is that, the service provider and the trafficker, right? We are in a power dynamic situation, regardless of whether or not we recognize it. And we are offering, in many cases, the same thing that the trafficker is offering usually with trivial demands and a top-down relationship and punishment when not compliant. Now, again, it's similar to those barriers to access, right? You have rules and people have to follow them. So that's why we have punishments when someone is not compliant as a service provider. But it's just important to remember how similar that looks to the person who's experienced the trauma. So the only thing, or maybe one of the only things that can differentiate us here is autonomy, is the ability to offer choices. We'll respond to the why and not the behavior, because now we know why these behaviors are happening because of the trauma. Be aware of our own biases. They're hard to overcome. Create a safe place, and definitely start with believing. And build trust. I mean, not everyone is ready to leave their situation, but if we're talking about investigations, not everybody is willing to just disclose it all in the moment. They're waiting to see if you are the person that they can trust. They're waiting to see if you believe them, right? And super important to have those protocols in place. We talked a lot about protocols 2 weeks ago. Before someone discloses to you, you may be the most trauma-informed and trauma-responsive organization in the world, and I hope you are, but you should have specific protocols in place for a human trafficking situation, because they're so unique. Every single one is so unique. So super important to know what resources are out there. Sorry, I'm just checking time. So I want to make sure that you do have some tools here, and then we're going to talk through some fundamentals of a survivor-centered investigation. So how are you going to be able to talk to somebody in order to elicit information without re-traumatizing someone? It's not always to the end game of a prosecution, though, there may be some on this call that would argue that with me. We do want to prosecute traffickers, of course we do, but we don't want to do it with the result being the re-traumatization and the re-victimization of victims. We want them to be at the center of our investigations in a way that is empowering. So they shouldn't be built on the victim, right? They should be supportive and empowering, and we should be able to build cases without victim participation, even though it's more challenging, because people matter, right? So there's some ways to elicit some behavior change that would hopefully result in more disclosure and more memories that you could use in investigation. The directive is pursuing this goal of the resolution of ambivalence when we're talking about motivational interviewing. So it's a client-centered counseling style for eliciting behavior change by helping clients to explore and resolve ambivalence. These are some of the fundamentals of motivational interviewing. You could do an entire day on motivational interviewing, so we're not going to get that, in the next 15 minutes here. But it's important to know the basics, and then I'm happy to talk with folks afterwards about a full motivational interviewing training, or sending you to some online resources for that. The idea is that motivation to change is elicited from a client, In other words, if we're thinking back to that stages of change model that we talked about 2 weeks ago, not everyone is ready for change exactly when we think they should be. And the easy example is thinking about someone who may smoke cigarettes, right? Everyone knows it's bad, but they're still not quitting. Why not? Even though I think they should. It's because not everybody's ready to change exactly when we think they should. So we're trying to motivate someone to change, we're trying to help, but it's going to be the client's choice. Direct persuasion is not an effective method. The counseling style is generally a quiet and eliciting one. Their readiness to change is not a client trait, but a fluctuating product of interpersonal interaction. I really like that line. Right? It's about the conversations that we're going to have, the interpersonal interactions that we're going to have with our clients are going to result in disclosure or not. And so it's about our relationships and our trust. So these are some techniques that you can use: open-ended questions, affirmations, reflective listening, and summary. I guess these sound fairly obvious, but of course you don't want to ask a question that can be answered with yes or no. And if somebody answers a question with yes or no, an easy follow-up is tell me more. Tell me more about that. Tell me what you mean by that. I also, I think like an overarching interaction technique here for ORs, for these 4 bullets here is quiet. So as mentioned here, the counseling style is generally a quiet and eliciting one. I think it's really important to just stop talking sometimes and really be practicing active listening, looking someone in the eye and listening. Not nodding, not smiling, just looking someone in the eye and giving them time, maybe more time than you feel comfortable with. I mean, it is a little bit uncomfortable to sit there with somebody while they, also sit there silently. But give them time, people will open up. Recognize the client's strengths, affirmations. I mean, it's amazing that you're here. It's amazing that you're willing to report or that you're even considering it. It's amazing that you want to heal from this. I'm so happy that you're here today. That is something we use on the hotline all the time too. You did the right thing by calling. Thank you so much for calling. People are scared. Letting them know that they're doing the right thing is super important. Reflective listening is super important too. So this is what I've heard you say. This is what I heard you say. And repeating that back to them, because often we get it wrong or like partially wrong. And so if we reflect it back and they hear it, they can correct us when we're wrong. And then the summary, and we do this on the hotline too. So this is what we talked about. These are the things that you said you wanted. These are the numbers that I gave you. These are the recommendations that we have for you. Next steps are you're going to call these organizations and you're going to call us back if you can't find any help once you make those calls. Does that sound like every single thing you want to tell us? Is there anything else you want to add? Is there anything else you've been considering? Are there any other details, right? And again, with that silence, people will usually add, I forgot to mention this, or there was this other thing that was bothering me. Thanks for asking. So using these techniques is really powerful and really simple. And this is just a review. You've seen this before, but this is that theoretical model of change. So just a reminder, right? Sometimes people are in the pre-contemplation or contemplation stage or even preparation. We want them to take an action, but they are simply not there yet. They have no intention of changing their behavior, or they're aware a problem exists and they have no commitment to action. So the idea here is to move people along through motivational interviewing and trust building in order to get to a place where they can take action. I think I want you to take away this biggest piece here is be flexible. I understand that those of you who work with law enforcement or even are victim advocates with law enforcement are expected to conduct an investigation. I mean, I get it. but it can't only be about that. It cannot only be about locking people up. It has to be about that victim. We have to readjust our expectations and redefine what we consider to be successful, because it's not every time we meet a victim or a survivor are we going to have a successful investigation. We don't get to decide if somebody is ready. So we really have to listen to survivors and ask them what they want and what they need, and be okay with that, because it's not about what we want and what we need, it's about what they need. Overall recommendations, right? Provide a calm, welcoming, and quiet environment or space. That sounds easy, but it's so important just to add that element of choice into into that actual space. Understand that balance of power. You are in a position of power, regardless of what it is that you do on this call right now. You're in a position of power, and so let people sit where they want to sit. Let people eat or not eat, right? Let people have other people in the room if they need to. If they want more than one person in the room, they don't feel comfortable being alone with you, something like that. No referring collaborating agencies. And I would also add, know their values and their response. Know what other organizations have been trained, and know that when you make a referral, you're going to be making it to somebody who is trauma informed also. If you send someone somewhere where they get treated like crap or they're re-traumatized, they will lose trust in you, right? That's pretty obvious, I guess. It's important to interview the survivor alone. We want to make sure that interpreters are being used if needed and not family or friends. We talked through different examples over the last 2 sessions of survivors that were not interviewed alone in many cases, and their trafficker was with them, coercing and intimidating them in the moment. And always make sure that you review the limits of your confidentiality. Now, it depends on your role, of course, what that confidentiality is, but you're going to lose trust if you suddenly turn on someone and say, hey, I have to report this, after they just told you everything out of their hearts, thinking that you wouldn't have to report. So just review the limits of your confidentiality during sensitive questioning. And then I want to finish off with survivor-centered investigations. Now, the Denver DA's office does like a really amazing job of this. I'm sure other DA's offices do too. So I'm not suggesting that there's no other DA's office that does a great job of this, but in my conversations with the Denver DA's office human trafficking unit, they really focus on investigations being they say victim-centered, I say survivor-centered, instead of victim-led. Again, remembering that each case should be supporting and empowering the victim and not necessarily only built on the victim's participation. Victims have rights. Not everybody is going to want to testify. And every case is different. You never know if there's going to be a jury or a judge. So the way that cases are built are going to be different as well. All investigations and interviews should start with believing. Even if you're saying that you believe someone, but yet not behaving that way, right? They're going to know, right? Survivors are going to be able to read your body language and your face and know that you don't believe them. So start from a place of believing. These stories are unbelievable, but I'm assuming that most of the people on this call have already heard really unbelievable stories. So this is not something new. So start from a place of believing, even if it sounds unbelievable. I'm so sorry this happened to you is a good place to start. Remember that delayed reporting is common. This sometimes affects our ability to believe, right? Why on earth would they have waited so long to come forward if this horrible thing was happening to them? And the answer is actually pretty simple. It could be the effects of trauma that we've already talked through. It could be the effects of drugs or alcohol. It could be that a memory doesn't come through until months or years later. And it could just be, could be fear. Think about if you're from a small town and your trafficker is a well-respected person in the community, and you have to see that trafficker every day. And so your ability to just go on with your daily routine is affected constantly by the trauma that you experienced. I think especially in smaller towns, we have this fear of reporting because there's a fear of not being believed. So delayed reporting is very common. Words matter, and I'm talking about not just when you're talking to somebody, which that's a little bit more obvious. You don't want to be demeaning in your language, all of that. You want to try to match or mirror the language of the person that you're talking to, sure. But words also matter when you're writing a report. So this is for healthcare providers or for any case manager or especially for any law enforcement, because what's in the report can be used against them later. So if you wrote something like the victim was intoxicated and uncooperative, right, that could be used against them. So when you're writing a report, be aware of your biases, be aware of what you're writing, which may be judgmental and biased. And yeah, just be aware that that report may be used against them. I already mentioned this, know your referral agencies and their responses. So important just to know that other organizations are responding the way you did. It's not that every organization that does anti-trafficking work has to come to some consensus on how to do anti-trafficking work. There are lots of different ways to do this work, but we can be upfront about our values, and that way you can know, or I can know when I call somebody, what their response is going to look like. And that's especially true if we have a community-wide protocol, which is what we talked about 2 weeks ago. So if every community, and however you define that community, it's going to be different. But if every community has their own protocol, then that knowing your referral agencies are already done. When you're doing a survivor-centered investigation, one important note is that evidence of similar crimes can be used. So it doesn't have to, so if the same person has been accused of, or there's others who have experienced exploitation, this again, labor or sex trafficking. I'm trying to think of an example of this that's recently been in the news, or we've had victims come forward and testify because they had previously experienced a similar type of exploitation. They didn't have to report it. It doesn't have to be a previous conviction. It can just be someone saying, yeah, I experienced this too. This happened to me too from this person. They didn't pay me. I didn't report it because I was scared. I was raped while I was working. So evidence of similar crimes can be used. Before you do any kind of interview, and this is, in a law enforcement setting or in any setting, child welfare, any kind of case management, be sure to wait 2 sleep cycles before an interview, because often sleep is used against somebody, and people are exhausted, and while they're exhausted, they're having exacerbated trauma symptoms. So if you can, try to wait 2 sleep cycles, or at least be aware that if you do an interview, before you wait 2 sleep cycles before you do an interview, that answers might be different later. Start with memories. So start with, what do you remember about, whatever it is, that person, that night, that place you used to live, that whatever, that experience. Just start there. Start with memories. Asking someone specific questions like, what did they look like? Or, what did they do next? Is just not helpful for somebody whose brain has experienced trauma. So start with, what do you remember? And move on from there, right? Tell me more. Were there any smells, sights, sounds, right? Start with memories. Don't have victims fill out a form if you can, especially if it's like an official form that could be used, in a law enforcement setting, they don't always know what's relevant, and that could be used against them. So like, why did you write this in the form but not tell law enforcement about this thing that happened to you? That could be used against them. So maybe fill out the form together, but don't have a victim fill out the form on their own, as they won't always know what's relevant, or they may leave stuff out, or a memory may be triggered and they may put extra stuff in there. So just try to help somebody fill out that form when possible.
Hey, Kara,
Yes.
let me ask your thoughts on something too. A really foundational DA training that I had gone to at one point talked about, like, don't ask people. So law enforcement, and if you're having someone testify or doing trial prep, don't ask people how long something took, right? Because we all know that if you're eating ice cream for 2 minutes, it seems shorter and more pleasurable than if someone is sexually assaulting you for 2 minutes. So they're probably going to dramatically over-report how long they think it was. And then again, defense counsel can use that against them, right? Really, he was strangling you for 6 minutes, and then they stop and start counting. So the advice that
Yeah.
we had received was, ask people, like, say, I'm going to start my timer, my watch now. You tell me when to stop it for how long this lasted, because it's going to be 15 seconds, whereas they would have told you it was 3 minutes. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's just a perfect example of what we're talking about here is, yeah, when people experience trauma, they don't remember things in a linear way. And so, yeah, exactly what you said, 15 seconds is going to feel like 3 or 5 or 10 minutes. And then that can be used against them. Exactly. So I think don't ask specific questions like that at all, but especially when it comes to time or, faces or, yeah, like people are going to remember things like breath smelled like cigarettes, um, and I was always hearing a dog barking better than they are going to remember that took exactly 2.5 minutes. So yeah, thank you, Kirsten. I think that's an excellent point. And that was it. That was that. So if there are any other questions, that was all I had. I always leave my slides on this note of the human trafficking hotline, because I want everyone to have these numbers in their phones at all times, because the people that you can talk to, will have a similar training to me. But are there any other questions or even comments? Are there any other tips that individuals who are on this call might have similar to Kirsten's?
We'll give folks a second to type. And meanwhile, I wanted to ask you, years ago, there was research showing that girls were more likely to get involved in the juvenile justice system, for lack of a better term, for unladylike behavior, and kind of an underlying discomfort or surveillance of girls' sexuality more so than boys. I was thinking back about the scenario you put up, truancy and different things. Are you aware of recent research which shows whether that is or isn't still the case? It's been a long
Yeah,
time since I
yeah,
saw all that. Yeah.
I don't know if I have. I mean, that sex abuse to prison pipeline did actually display that. Is one example, but I don't know of others offhand. There's a really cool article out there called "Girl Interrupted: The Erasure of a Black Girl's Childhood," that looks at that over-sexualization and misrepresentation of age of especially girls of color, that are considered, they should be acting older, or they look older, they're treated older than they are. So I've seen some stuff like that, but I don't know if it was specifically looking at the difference between boys and girls. Yeah.
I'm going to put that in the chat box. It was Girl Interrupted. What was
Yeah,
the
Girl
rest?
Interrupted, semicolon, the erasure of a Black girl's childhood.
Okay.
And then the other one, the one that I was showing earlier, is sex abuse to prison pipeline.
Okay, great.
And you can find either of those online. I don't think there's no paywall or anything.
Great. Not seeing any questions at the moment. That was a lot of great information to think on. Do you just want to take a moment and tell folks, I know we're all still kind of COVID grounded, but for folks who may not be aware of the trainings that you can potentially offer in person when, or what you're doing up to training wise?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So LCHD, we have a focus funding-wise on training healthcare providers, law enforcement, and those working in the child welfare space or with systems-involved youth. So not just state child welfare workers, but those like CASAs, those who are working like guardian ad litems, those who are working with systems-involved youth. So we have a little bit of a focus on those, and we have specific curricula for those groups. We can do a 101, a 201, or a 301. And so it's like if we do the full 301 session, that's like 8 full hours. Obviously not all at once. But normally we'll do a 101 in either 1 to 2 hours, depending on how much time people have. And we've been doing everything online right now. So, in a perfect world, we'd be doing these in person, but right now we're online, and we can invite as many people that are interested. So please do reach out if you need a training. We also have a specific training for homeless advocates or people who are working with individuals experiencing homelessness. I'm trying to think of what other specific groups. We really will train anyone, and every training that we do is made geographically specific and then tailored to suit the audience. So please do reach out. They're free. And we're right now we're doing 15-ish a month, something like that. So we're busy.
Yeah, keeps us all out of trouble. Well, thank you, Kara. I appreciate that. And for folks who might have missed the session 2 weeks ago, it's on COVA's YouTube channel, which you can access through our website, coloradocrimevictims.org. And then there's a trainings and archived webinars tab. Any trouble finding that, go ahead and let